After years of diligent work, John Walker, a retired firefighter, finally enjoys the comfort of his dream home in the quiet suburbs of Denver. He takes pride in the peaceful life he has built, relishing the calm mornings and evenings in his spacious backyard. However, his tranquility is shattered one afternoon when a police car pulls into his driveway. The officers, unaware of John's background, have arrived in response to a report of trespassing. The sight of law enforcement in his yard disrupts the peaceful routine he's come to cherish. As he watches them approach his doorstep, John is left wondering who would falsely accuse him of such an offense in his own home. Little does he know, this marks the beginning of a series of unfortunate events that will challenge both his patience and his new life. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If this story made you reflect, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful content. John Walker had only been living in his new home for a couple of months, but it didn't take long for him to realize that not everyone in the neighborhood was as welcoming as he had hoped. His next-door neighbor, Claire Johnson, seemed particularly interested in his every move. One afternoon, John noticed her staring at him through the window of her house, watching intently as he worked on his lawn. At first, he thought little of it, chalking it up to idle curiosity. However, as the days went by, it became increasingly apparent that Claire had developed an unusual fixation on him. One evening, as John was relaxing on his porch after a long day, Claire made her first uninvited visit to his property. She approached him, offering a peculiar excuse for being there. "I thought you were the gardener," she claimed, clearly caught off guard when John greeted her at the gate. She stood on his front step for a moment, unsure of what to say next, before awkwardly turning and walking back to her house. It didn't sit well with John, especially since his profession had never been related to landscaping. He knew then that something wasn't right. The next day, he noticed Claire's behavior had become even more erratic. She began sneaking onto his property when he wasn't home, taking long, deliberate walks around his backyard, peering through his windows, and even crossing his lawn to get a closer look at the house. John was beginning to feel uncomfortable in his own home. It didn't take long for Claire's actions to escalate. John had hoped that her strange behavior would subside, but instead, it only grew worse. It wasn't long before Claire took things to the next level. One afternoon, when John had stepped out to run errands, Claire took the opportunity to trespass once again. This time, she went a step further and climbed over his fence to enter his backyard. When John returned later that day, he was shocked to find Claire hosting a small gathering in his pool area. Her friends were lounging by the pool, enjoying the sunny afternoon, completely unaware of the boundaries they were crossing. John stood in disbelief at the scene unfolding in his own yard. Without hesitation, he marched over to confront her. "Claire, what do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. She looked up, startled, then quickly mumbled an apology, claiming that she thought it was a public pool. John wasn't convinced. She had clearly crossed a line, and her excuses were no longer enough to justify her increasingly invasive behavior. Despite the confrontation, Claire didn't seem to grasp the severity of the situation. Over the following weeks, she continued to trespass, often entering his yard without any warning or permission. It wasn't just her disregard for boundaries that disturbed John, it was her refusal to acknowledge his ownership of the property. Each time he confronted her, she dismissed his claims, insisting that the house and the pool were for the neighborhood to enjoy. John's patience was wearing thin. He had tried to remain cordial and understanding, but it was clear that Claire wasn't taking him seriously. One evening, after another incident where Claire hosted a party in his backyard, John knew it was time to take action. He called the police, explaining the ongoing issues he had with Claire. However, when the officers arrived, Claire once again claimed that she had been invited. It seemed like her antics were only escalating, and John realized that if he didn't act soon, things might spiral completely out of control. This provides a more detailed expansion of the events while maintaining the tone and key elements of the original story. After several weeks of escalating tension with Claire Johnson, John Walker was at his breaking point. Despite multiple attempts to reason with her and explain the boundaries of his property, Claire seemed undeterred. She continued to show blatant disrespect for his rights as a homeowner, dismissing his ownership of the house and his need for privacy. John had been patient, but Claire's behavior was growing increasingly erratic and disruptive. One morning, John woke to the sound of laughter and music coming from his backyard. He stepped outside and, once again, found Claire and her friends lounging by the pool, this time without even attempting to ask for permission. Furious, John stormed over to confront her once more. "Claire! This is my property. You can't just keep coming here without permission," he said, his voice rising in frustration. Claire, unbothered, casually shrugged and made another excuse. "Oh, I thought we could just hang out. The pool looks so inviting today." John's patience was finally exhausted. He realized that Claire wasn't going to stop on her own, and the constant intrusion into his personal space had become unbearable. This wasn't just about a few parties, it was about her complete disregard for his boundaries and the lack of respect for the law. He knew that if he didn't take more drastic action, things would only get worse. Determined to put an end to the constant trespassing, John decided to take the next step. He called the police yet again, but this time he was ready. When the officers arrived, he presented evidence of Claire's repeated intrusions, photos from his security cameras and a detailed log of the times she'd entered his property without permission. He even had footage of her hosting another party in his backyard, all without his consent. The officers listened patiently to John's side of the story before turning to Claire. She tried to defend herself, claiming that she was just being friendly, but the evidence was undeniable. After a brief discussion, the police made it clear to Claire that her actions were illegal and unacceptable. They informed her that she was no longer welcome on John's property and would face consequences if she continued to trespass. With the police finally taking his side, John felt a sense of relief. He had done everything he could to handle the situation calmly, but now, with the law backing him up, he hoped that Claire would finally understand the seriousness of her actions. However, this was far from over, and John knew he would have to remain vigilant. Despite the police intervention, Claire Johnson's behavior continued to spiral out of control. John Walker had hoped that the warning from the officers would put an end to the trespassing and disrupt her pattern of harassment, but it seemed that Claire was far from understanding the gravity of the situation. In the days following the police visit, John noticed that Claire was becoming increasingly hostile, not just toward him but also toward the entire neighborhood. Her actions were no longer confined to simple intrusions, she began to escalate her behavior in alarming ways. One afternoon, John stepped outside to find his garden had been vandalized. The delicate flowers he had worked so hard to cultivate were trampled, and several of his plants had been uprooted. Upon closer inspection, John could see that some of the plants appeared to have been poisoned. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately sabotaged his efforts. John's heart sank as he realized that Claire was behind it. As the days went by, more strange occurrences took place. His front porch had been covered in litter and broken glass, his mailbox had been damaged, and John even discovered that his morning newspaper had been stolen on multiple occasions. He had seen Claire and her friends loitering around his property in the past, and it wasn't difficult to piece together that she was behind these disturbances. It was clear that Claire had not only crossed legal boundaries but was now purposefully trying to ruin his peace of mind. Feeling desperate, John knew he needed to gather evidence. He installed security cameras around his property to catch any further acts of vandalism or trespassing. It didn't take long for the cameras to capture Claire in action. There she was again, creeping around his garden in the dead of night, pouring something onto his plants and cutting down a few branches. One of the cameras even caught her stealing his newspaper from the front steps. John was sickened by the lengths Claire was willing to go to make his life miserable. It was no longer just a neighborly dispute, it was an ongoing campaign of harassment. With the video footage in hand, John knew he had the evidence he needed to put an end to this nightmare once and for all. He wasn't going to let Claire's spiteful actions go unpunished. But he also knew that he would have to be strategic in his next move if he wanted to reclaim his peace. John Walker had spent weeks tolerating Claire Johnson's disruptive behavior, but now, with the mounting evidence of her trespassing, vandalism, and harassment, he knew it was time to take control of the situation. Claire's petty actions had gone far beyond what anyone should endure from a neighbor. It was no longer just a matter of confronting her, it was about making sure she felt the consequences of her ongoing behavior. John wasn't the kind of person to retaliate with violence or aggression, but he had an idea that would allow him to get back at her in a way that was both harmless and, ultimately, satisfying. He had noticed something peculiar about Claire and her friends over the past few weeks. Every time they came to visit her house, they would spend a lot of time in and around the pool, always wearing excessive amounts of makeup. John realized that this might provide the perfect opportunity for a harmless yet effective form of revenge. Over the last few years, John had worked in various chemical labs and had a keen understanding of how substances interacted. With this knowledge in mind, he came up with a plan. He decided to use a non-toxic pool dye, harmless to the body but highly reactive with certain types of cosmetics, including the foundation and makeup products that Claire often wore. The dye, when added to the pool, wouldn't be visible right away, but once anyone with the makeup swam in the water, the dye would cause their skin to turn an unmistakable shade of green. It was a brilliant, subtle way to make Claire feel the consequences of her behavior, without causing her any permanent harm. John carefully added the dye to the pool during the night when Claire wasn't around, making sure the pool water looked normal in the morning. He knew it would be only a matter of time before Claire and her friends decided to take a dip again. With everything set, John felt a sense of calm wash over him. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoring some semblance of justice and balance to his life. The next day, John kept his distance, pretending to go about his normal routine. But he knew that Claire, with her signature makeup, would soon be walking into the trap he had set. He could already picture the look on her face when she and her friends took a swim and realized what had happened. John Walker could hardly contain his amusement as the day of his carefully planned revenge arrived. The pool dye he had added the night before was working exactly as he had hoped, and now, it was only a matter of time before Claire Johnson and her friends would experience the consequences of their continued disregard for his property. John had grown increasingly tired of Claire's invasive and disrespectful behavior, and although he had hoped the police would put an end to it, nothing had worked until now. This harmless prank was the perfect way to make her pay for her constant trespassing, without causing any permanent harm. Late that afternoon, John could see Claire and a few of her friends heading toward the backyard, their usual exaggerated makeup perfectly in place. They were laughing and chatting, completely unaware of what awaited them. As they entered the pool area and eagerly jumped into the water, John casually watched from his porch, pretending to be lost in his own thoughts. It didn't take long for the effects of the dye to kick in. Slowly but surely, the bright green hue began to appear on Claire and her friends' faces, arms, and necks. At first, they didn't seem to notice, but as they swam around, their skin began to take on a vibrant green tone, especially where the water had touched. Within minutes, their faces were a shocking shade of green, and the realization hit them like a wave. The shrieks of shock and confusion were unmistakable. Claire and her friends started to panic, desperately trying to scrub their skin, but the green color remained stubbornly stuck. It didn't help that the dye reacted specifically with the makeup they wore, making their skin look even more intense. They were utterly baffled, and the sight was enough to send John into quiet fits of laughter. He hadn't expected the transformation to be so dramatic. Soon, Claire and her friends started shouting and calling for help, but there was no escape from the situation. Their embarrassing predicament was already being recorded by the neighbors, who had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. John knew it wouldn't be long before the video went viral. Claire had become a laughingstock in the community, and John couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that, for once, it was her who was on the receiving end of the attention. As John watched the chaos unfold in his backyard, he realized that the prank had done more than just pay back Claire, it had brought a sense of justice and balance to the neighborhood. Everyone had witnessed her rude and disruptive behavior, and now, she was being forced to face the consequences. For the first time in months, John felt a deep sense of peace and triumph. The tables had finally turned. The chaos that ensued after Claire Johnson and her friends swam in John Walker's pool turned out to be just the beginning of their downfall. Within hours of their shocking transformation, the video of their green-faced debacle had gone viral. It spread quickly across social media platforms, shared by amused neighbors and onlookers who had witnessed the entire spectacle. People couldn't get enough of the absurdity of it all. Memes were created, jokes were made, and before long, Claire's humiliating moment was the talk of the town. At first, Claire seemed oblivious to the severity of the situation. She and her friends had scrambled out of the pool in a panic, but their green skin was impossible to hide. No matter how much they scrubbed or tried to wash off the dye, it remained. The once confident, prideful neighbor had become the laughingstock of the entire community. John had watched the video unfold with a quiet satisfaction, but the ripple effects were far beyond what he had anticipated. As the video continued to gain traction online, Claire's reputation took a hit that she could never recover from. Her colleagues at work started distancing themselves from her, and her friends, who had also been caught in the embarrassing incident, began to withdraw. People she had once thought of as allies were now avoiding her, and the social stigma she had earned was spreading quickly. Even her real estate agency, where she worked as an agent, issued a statement publicly distancing themselves from her. The agency had to protect its image, and Claire was no longer part of that image. The worst part for Claire was that, in a world of social media and constant connectivity, her embarrassing moment was likely to live on forever. The video of her and her friends, their faces bright green from the pool dye, became a permanent part of the internet's collective memory. John couldn't help but feel a sense of justice as he watched the downfall of someone who had made his life miserable for so long. For Claire, the viral video was a wake-up call, but it was too late. The damage had been done. As the days passed, she tried to do damage control, apologizing to those around her and attempting to explain away what had happened. But her efforts only seemed to make things worse. The more she tried to cover up her embarrassing moment, the more it became clear that she would never be able to erase the humiliation. Meanwhile, John sat back, content with the knowledge that his quiet revenge had not only given him the peace he deserved, but it had also brought the community closer together. People who had once been hesitant to speak out now bonded over Claire's downfall, and John was once again able to enjoy his home in peace. As Claire Johnson tried to salvage what was left of her reputation, John Walker could see that no matter how hard she worked to erase the embarrassment she had caused herself, the damage was already done. Her viral video had exploded across social media, and every attempt she made to explain herself only seemed to make things worse. The once proud real estate agent had become the subject of countless memes, jokes, and even mockery at the hands of her colleagues. It wasn't just her green transformation that had caused the downfall, it was her inability to handle the situation with any dignity. In the days following the pool incident, Claire made numerous attempts to explain her side of the story. She tried to convince her coworkers and friends that it was all a misunderstanding, that she had simply been a victim of a prank that had gone too far. But no one seemed to buy her explanation. The more she tried to downplay the situation, the more people saw her as desperate to save face. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Claire posted a series of statements on social media, claiming that she was harassed and that her green appearance was the result of a toxic situation rather than the harmless pool dye. However, these statements only fueled the fire. People quickly pointed out the absurdity of her claims, especially when the video clearly showed her and her friends willingly diving into the pool, oblivious to the dye. The backlash from the community was swift and unforgiving. People started questioning her integrity as a professional, and clients began pulling out of deals that had been in the works. The damage Claire had inflicted on her own career was irreversible. Meanwhile, John watched from the sidelines with quiet satisfaction. He wasn't gloating, but there was a sense of justice in seeing Claire face the consequences of her actions. She had tormented him for so long, and now, the tables had turned. John had taken the high road throughout the entire ordeal, choosing not to retaliate with malice but instead allowing the situation to unfold naturally. His decision to use the harmless pool die had struck a perfect balance of retribution without causing any permanent harm. As Claire's reputation crumbled, John was able to focus on the peace he had been craving. The neighborhood, once divided by Claire's disruptive behavior, began to bond over the shared experience. Neighbors who had kept to themselves now greeted each other with warmth, and even those who had been skeptical of John's actions began to respect his calm and measured approach to the conflict. The story of Claire's green transformation was passed around in the neighborhood for years to come, but John knew that, for him, it would always represent the moment when he regained control over his own life. As the weeks passed, Claire Johnson's attempts at damage control became increasingly futile. Her efforts to explain away the viral video and the public humiliation she had endured only deepened the hole she had dug for herself. The community's perception of her had already been permanently altered. The embarrassing moment in John Walker's backyard had left an indelible mark, and no amount of apologies or excuses could undo the damage. The social media backlash was unrelenting, and her professional life had taken a hit that she could never recover from. Claire's real estate agency, already distancing itself from her in the wake of the scandal, eventually made the decision to let her go. Her once promising career in real estate had come to a sudden and unceremonious end. Colleagues and clients who had once praised her professionalism now viewed her as a cautionary tale of hubris and entitlement. Her connections in the industry dwindled as potential buyers and sellers sought out agents they deemed more reliable and trustworthy. The final blow came when Claire decided to leave the neighborhood entirely. The once proud woman, who had strutted around with a sense of superiority, now found herself packing up her belongings and moving out of the very community she had once tried to control. Her green transformation had not only humiliated her publicly, but it had also shattered her sense of security and pride. There was no way she could stay in a place where everyone knew her as the woman who had been made a fool of by a harmless prank. John, on the other hand, felt a deep sense of peace in the aftermath of everything that had transpired. He had never sought revenge for the sake of cruelty but had simply wanted to reclaim his space and peace of mind. By using the pool die, he had done just enough to remind Claire that her behavior had consequences, without causing her any lasting harm. It had been a clever, non-violent way to address the wrongs she had inflicted on him. As Claire packed up and left, John's neighborhood became stronger and more united. People who had once kept their distance from each other now came together to share their stories of dealing with Claire's behavior. John, who had been at the center of the conflict, now found himself surrounded by neighbors who respected his calm demeanor and integrity. The incident, though unfortunate, had bonded the community in a way nothing else could. And so, with Claire's departure, John could finally relax in the home he had worked so hard for. As he looked back on the events that had unfolded, he realized that standing up to Claire not only restored his peace but also helped forge a sense of unity in his neighborhood that would last for years to come. As the months passed, John Walker found himself reflecting on the events that had transpired, especially as the neighborhood continued to grow closer. Claire Johnson's departure had, in many ways, marked a turning point not just for John but for the entire community. What had started as a quiet, peaceful life had been upended by Claire's invasive behavior, but in the end, John's resilience and patience had prevailed. John often thought back to the moment when Claire's video had gone viral, and how, at that time, he had been unsure if his quiet actions would lead to any real change. At first, all he wanted was to reclaim his peace, his property, his space, his life, but he had never anticipated that standing up to her would have such a profound effect on the neighborhood as a whole. He had spent years working hard to finally settle into his dream home, and though it had taken time and patience to achieve, the peace he'd worked so hard for was shattered by Claire's reckless actions. Her consistent trespassing and harassment had made every day a challenge. It was only after taking a stand that John realized how much he had been pushed to the limit. His desire to maintain peace had been tested by Claire's relentless interference. Yet, in the end, his decision to handle things calmly had worked, and he had achieved something much greater than just personal satisfaction. It had brought unity to the entire block. As the neighborhood buzzed with stories of Claire's embarrassing green transformation, John couldn't help but smile, knowing that despite everything she had put him through, he had never once lost his sense of calm or dignity. The video, though initially humiliating for Claire, had become a symbol of justice and balance in the neighborhood. It served as a reminder that there were always consequences to one's actions, no matter how subtle the retribution. What John hadn't expected was the ripple effect the incident had on his own character. He had learned the true value of standing firm without resorting to violence or vengeance. Claire had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but in the end, he had done more than just protect his property, he had defended his peace of mind. The community that had once been divided over her disruptive behavior was now united by shared experiences and mutual respect. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the neighborhood come together for a block party, John realized that he had achieved more than just the peace he had fought for. He had helped create an environment where his neighbors could feel safe, respected, and, most importantly, united. Claire's departure had been painful for her, but for John and the neighborhood, it was a new beginning. As time went on, John Walker's life slowly returned to the calm he had longed for when he first moved into his dream home. The saga of Claire Johnson's disruptive behavior and eventual downfall had become a thing of the past, but its effects rippled through the community, leaving an undeniable mark on everyone involved. John couldn't help but reflect on the chain of events that had unfolded, how a simple act of standing his ground had ultimately strengthened the bond within the neighborhood. Claire had moved away, leaving behind the reputation she had so carelessly built for herself. Her departure, while painful for her, had made a lasting impact on the area. People who had once kept their distance from each other now shared stories of how they had dealt with Claire's intrusive nature. Conversations that once revolved around small talk now included shared experiences and mutual respect for one another. The neighborhood, once divided, had grown closer in a way that no one could have predicted. John had unknowingly become the catalyst for that change. For John, the experience had taught him invaluable lessons. The most important of those lessons was that standing up for yourself doesn't always require aggression or confrontation. It had been the subtle, almost playful act of using harmless pool dye that had put an end to Claire's reign of discomfort. John had shown that it wasn't always about getting revenge, it was about protecting his peace while still maintaining integrity. The balance he had achieved was one that had not only protected him but had ultimately led to a healthier, more unified environment for everyone in the neighborhood. Though John hadn't intended to make a statement to the wider world, the story of his stand against Claire had become a symbol of justice. His calm, measured response to Claire's repeated violations had taught his neighbors that standing firm didn't mean resorting to extreme measures. It meant knowing when to act and, most importantly, when to remain calm. The viral video of Claire's green transformation, once a source of ridicule, had turned into a local legend that was recounted with a sense of pride by those who had witnessed it. As John sat on his porch one evening, looking out over the now tight-knit community, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet fulfillment. Claire's departure had closed one chapter, but it had also opened a new one where respect, unity, and mutual understanding were at the forefront. John's quiet triumph had not only restored peace to his home but had also left behind a legacy of justice that would be remembered for years to come. Months after Claire Johnson's departure, John Walker found himself reflecting on how far things had come. The community, once fractured by her disruptive behavior, had become stronger and more united. It wasn't just about the justice he had sought for himself anymore, it was about the lasting impact of his actions on the people around him. As John sat on his porch, watching neighbors greet each other with warm smiles and open conversations, he realized how much the events had changed the dynamic of the entire block. The story of Claire's green transformation had been passed down as a light-hearted tale, but it was also a reminder of what happens when someone refuses to respect boundaries. People had learned the importance of standing up for themselves, but without resorting to unnecessary conflict. John's quiet, clever approach had demonstrated that sometimes, the best form of justice doesn't come with loud declarations, it comes with quiet, determined action. The peace he had worked so hard for was no longer something he just protected, it was something that had been shared by everyone in the neighborhood. John's patience and ability to remain calm in the face of Claire's escalating behavior had not only reclaimed his space but had allowed the community to grow stronger. It was a lasting lesson in respect, dignity, and the power of collective unity. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over his home, John felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His life had returned to the peaceful existence he had always dreamed of, and he knew that, in the end, standing up for his own peace had brought about something even more meaningful, a stronger, more connected neighborhood.